Hi everyone. This is our chief final conference paper with Anton. Our paper is titled Acting as the Other: The Discourse and Practices of Cultural Diversity in Transcending and Upholding Social Boundaries by Youth in Coventry, UK. In this paper, we are going to look at two case studies we completed in Coventry. The first case study is my case study in a youth club, and the second case study is Anton's case study in a youth theatre group. So, our presentation will start with two ethnographic observations into the different settings, two youth club settings in Coventry. On one rainy afternoon, I was at the youth club when a group of five young girls rushed into the room with their school uniforms, loudly giggling and laughing. Adriana, a 15 years old Slovak Roma girl who was apparently the oldest and the leader of the group, had already got rid of her school tie and uniform. She had big hoop earrings and was singing loudly with her hands moving like a rapper while twerking at the same time. Zuzana, a 13 years old from the same Slovak Roma girls group, whom I know from our several rap singing sessions during the youth club, approached me. Without any chit chat, she leaned towards me while trying to put on her big hoop earrings like the ones Adriana has. She whispered, "Miss, I'm pregnant." Her gaze was dramatic but stern. She was looking at my face carefully, expecting to see only. I was baffled and couldn't quite figure out whether she said what she said. She casually repeated, "I'm pregnant." Even though I was trying to process what she told me, I just noticed other girls at the back, intently listening and giggling. One addressed me directly. "Yes, miss, she's pregnant, she's pregnant." I didn't know how to respond. None of my answers would have been cool anyway. It was not the first time young people in the youth club were playing the bad. In fact, often boys were playing the gang member or the tough man who smoke weed, carry a gun, or involved in drug business, pretending like a drill artist who used to be a gang member, acting like a rapper, or pretending as if they were smoking a joint were often featured in this plays by some of the boys. When I asked the boys what they were doing, I was several times told that they were simply the bad guys. In some other instances, their responses also included expressions such as, "We are the gang members. We are smoking weed and we will sell drugs." Alongside their laughter, they were always staring at my face, expecting to see a shocked reaction on my face. Why do these girls pretend to be a stereotypical working class young woman who is often presented as a school dropout teenage mother? Or why were the boys frequently playing the gang members? Why were they why were young people in the youth club performing these almost theatricalized, um, exaggerated, farcical impersonations? Were these impersonations related to their experiences of living in a disadvantaged and stigmatized neighborhood? How are we to understand this embracing of the stigma? What does this tell us about the way the young forge their subjectivities in disadvantaged settings?
One Thursday evening in January 2019, the youth theatre session was progressing with the preparation to the performance on the topic of human rights and refugees. Practitioners tasked young people to enact the different forms of violation of human rights that might lead to people becoming refugees. Essentially, they were asked to express through physical performance acts of violence. For this, they worked out some bodily moves, technically rather complex and physically demanding, requiring close bodily contacts and hence reminding some martial art moves. They did this first in pairs and then in small groups. Becky and Julia are friends, both 15 years old girls from white British middle class families. And they worked as pair at this session as they did during many other sessions. And as during other sessions, they were eventually separated by the practitioners who insisted on young people changing their rehearsal partners regularly. The physically demanding moves made them visibly rather uncomfortable executing them. Becky was sometimes just indicating a move rather than executing it fully and technically correct. Later, they were assigned to different groups. Becky was performing a person surviving the violence of the group. Julia was enacting someone perpetrating a violent act. At some point during this session, Becky approached Archie, a junior practitioner at the theater, a man almost twice older than her, and playfully attacked him, imitating kicking and hitting moves in a dance-like sequence. Archie played along, and they have a bit of laughter. Few months later after this session, in her interview, Becky told me that she felt so happy at the youth theatre workshop because she could be her real self there. This session was a training preparation for a show that was staged during the Refugee Week in July 2019. As a charity organization, the youth theatre contributed the money raised from the sales of the show tickets to the City Refugees and Migrant Center. It was just one of the several fundraising events organized by the theatre to help city's refugee population that year. In October 2019, several young performers spent a night sleeping rough in the ruins of the old Coventry Cathedral, emulating the experience of numerous destitute people, including some refugees, visible on the streets of the city. Some young participants of the theatre committed themselves to live on one week on refugees' ration, eating meals cooked from a very simple and restricted list of products. When I asked Julia about that aspect of her activities as a young performer, she provided a very thoughtful reflection on her social position in relation to the less fortunate other. Raising money because we're essential, all of everybody who is in the theatre is privileged, and we have this opportunity to raise not only awareness but money that could help and provide for people who really just cannot. And I think that's so cool and amazing. We'll have homes to go to, parents to go to, a safe house, food in the supermarkets, cars on the roads. And to know that people have actually gone through that, it really does put you on a privileged pedestal. I think it is very, very important. It is also very grounding. These two snapshots from my ethnography with the young youth physical theatre in Coventry raises questions. Why did Becky and Julia put themselves willingly through this rather uncomfortable experience of enactment and embodiment of refugees' hardship? And how did this experience of enacting violence and playing the refugees make them realize their real self, as Becky put it? Thus, playing the refugee and embodying an experience of destitute people helped them realize their privileged self, where charity and raising money for those in need, refugees for example, became a duty or responsibility that comes with that privilege.
Before we discuss our findings, we would like to give some contextual information about these two youth settings in Coventry. First of all, we would like to remind that Coventry is the city of culture in 2011, and the city is celebrating the cultural diversity and inclusivity. So these two stories were taking place in one city just a couple of miles from each other in two youth clubs. They both have a striking performance aspect in them, an institutionalized one in the case of the youth theater and rather unexpected in the case of Roma youth behavior in the youth club. This contrast is experiencing cultural diversity by youth from different backgrounds in the same city is telling. On the one hand, cultural diversity is celebrated through the art and drama in the case of the middle-class youth of the theater. On the other hand, stigma and police surveillance frames cultural diversity for the youth who themselves belong to migrant and minority communities.
The questions this paper raises are: how do young people from different ethnic and class positions imagine, experience, and project cultural diversity? What do these different strategies of engaging with the other as a reference point of cultural diversity tell us about young people's perceptions and presentations of themselves? In our search for the answers to these questions, we look for a number of different theoretical contributions from scholars working in the field of um, uh, self-realization and othering. One, perhaps most obvious contribution comes from Stuart Hall, who maintained that identity is articulated through differences as differences between the self and the other. The dialogic relationship with the other constitutes the core of the identification process, through which individuals internalize and reproduce social structures by enacting and embodying them.
Another important stream of research is looking at socioeconomic and cultural inequalities. Since we are talking about middle class youth and also working class or marginalized youth, we saw that there's research about middle classes or middle class youth about agency, how privilege is embodied by becoming at ease, the role of the importance of interactions or the habitus. For working class youth, researchers mentioned how they respond to stigmatization, racism, othering, or the criminalization, or there's research on school dropouts or laddish culture. Another stream of research focuses on cultural sociology, mainly looking at cultural inclusion, cultural inequality, and mainly participation practices. So we see Fraser, for instance, looking at status inequality or the problems regarding parity of participation, the impact of institutional misrecognition on young people. Another important aspect is self-esteem and self-realization. So we see Honnet and Fraser also mentions this about self-confidence, self-esteem, self-respect, this critical role of interaction, everyday interactions on developing self-realization. Equally, Sayer mentions the moral boundaries, how people treat others or how they are treated by them is critical for their subjective or objective well-being and how they develop moral borders. We found Lamont's perspective also very useful for our paper because Lamont mentions the realization of groupness and also she mentions the importance of cultural repertoires within given historical, socioeconomic, and institutional contexts.
In our interpretation of experiences of young people in these two settings, we emphasize the performative aspect of identification process, more specifically the dramatization of the other. And here we need to talk about playfulness as ability to test the ambiguity of norm, as ability to test the boundaries of the moral orders. When Becky's and Julia's experience in the youth theater is told alongside the story of the Slovak Roma kids in the youth club, as we just done here, they highlight a striking difference in how two groups imagine and portray the underprivileged other. Driven by empathy, the embodiment of violent and traumatic experiences of refugees and homeless is encouraged and prized in the case of and praised in the case of the youth theater. This results in young performers being able to look at the hardship of the other from above, the pedestal of privilege, in Julia's words. The other is enacted and experienced affectively, but also imagined as a victim and passive recipient of the charity from the privileged. An ability to recognize the suffering of the other and be charitable to elevate this hardship is indeed intrinsic to this privilege, which then downplayed to assume a more humble, grounded position.
On the other hand, if we consider the youth club, we see a different picture. An exaggerated version of the working class youth has been played as a parody aiming to shock the ethnographer, who is seen by the Slovak Roma kids as one of the youth workers, an outsider in a position of authority. It is as if they play a parody on how the outsiders would imagine them. By making laugh of this stigmatized perception of the other, they both demonstrate their awareness of it and resist the projection of such othering on themselves as a minority group with a migrant background. Arguably, playing such exaggerated perceptions of the other, they distance themselves from the image of the undesirable, underprivileged other, the stigma of association with which they might have experienced themselves. Significantly, such playful representation of the working class youth is far from being encouraged by the youth workers who would see in it a disrespectful and violent behavior towards which the youth club has a zero tolerance policy, expelling youth from attending it for the rest of the day or not allowing the Roma boys attend the session as a group.
We would like to stop here. We thank you for your attention and we see this presentation as a just beginning of our discussion. Hopefully it provokes a lot of questions.
Thank you. Goodbye.